Today, I will explore paintings of the pre-Socratic philosophers Democritus and Heraclitus, who were known from ancient times as the laughing and the weeping philosopher. Somewhat later in the talk, I'll tell you a little bit more about these two philosophers, but really you don't need to know much more about them than that Democritus laughed and Heraclitus wept. Here are a few of the many portraits of Democritus and Heraclitus I will not discuss during this talk. But since I've got them here in front of me, I'll say one or two things. I am interested in these philosophers, in the ways in which these philosophers are represented in double portraiture, and also in how they are represented in single portraiture. So we see the images of Democritus and Heraclitus frequently together. In fact, they were associated with one another right since the beginning of the Renaissance, and indeed in ancient times. It was this woodcut from Andrea Alciato's emblem book, Emblemata, which was published in 1531, that first caught my attention over 30 years ago. Its motto, "In human life," indicates a humanist concern that led me on a decades-long exploration of how people might respond to the tragic limitations of human life. The image before you is striking in characteristic woodcut fashion for its simplicity, but it has an elegant simplicity. And I'll draw to your attention a few features. The composition of the image, the fact that the two philosophers sit by side in quite different postures, Democritus upward tending and jovial, Heraclitus downward tending and sad. The fact that their design indicates a relationship between the two philosophers, like that of distorted mirrors. And the fact that together they define something of the geometry of a circle. The costume is interesting. The facial characteristics, that one man is beardless and the other bearded, is interesting. And finally, the gestures are interesting. In the foreground is an open book. In the background is a prospect scene, a landscape scene. And in the very far distance, you might be able to discern remnants of a city. The philosophers look forward, but the book and prospect scene belong to them, as if subject to their interpretation for the viewer. They are the frontispiece and proscenium of what were known as the book and theatre of the world. Democritus and Heraclitus are spectators, readers, and explicators of the world. They look upon the world in two perspectives, through a broad landscape prospect and through transient things of the world, and especially personal and domestic property and human arts. Renaissance paintings painted religious narratives. They painted landscapes, often to frame biblical stories or allegories drawn on pagan and mythological themes. Building on a tradition of images of the saints, artists also painted portraits. Later, as a variation on portraiture, the still life genre isolated destructive forces of time in constructed elements of art, things found and arranged by the artist for artistic use. Household objects, flowers in their last blush, spent orange peels. The paradox of animate life found in the inanimate was registered, in short, by domestic things, living or dead plants and animals, or skulls and human remains. Why not dead philosophers who saw the world in terms of such household things? Jacques Deguen's painting Vanitas from 1603 combines the material aspects of a still life with a less material soap bubble of dreams. The bottom half of this painting displays a number of still life features, particularly on the Vanitas theme. Vanitas theme derives from the book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And here the painting illustrates human mortality and the mortality of all things, the transits of all things. Above the skull, in this little alcove, is a soap bubble image which has its own narrative painted within it. It's not really discernible to us here. And above this soap bubble image on either side of the alcove are the ancient philosophers Democritus and Heraclitus, pointing at the dream world of human ambition. Democritus laughs and Heraclitus weeps. And there's a strange aura about Democritus' head, about which I will say nothing at the moment. While still lifes had long featured in religious painting and domestic art, this painting is one of the first formalized as part of a genre. And a cousin of portraits of philosophers on the Vanitas theme. The still life was also a vehicle for training visual artists. It taught how to capture life realistically while exposing its ephemerality. In the same way, the portrait pose, necessarily rigid and immutable, simulated a still life. The 19th century painter Cézanne once said to a sitter, "You've ruined the pose. I tell you in all seriousness, you must hold it like an apple. Does an apple move?" The Renaissance portrait might set the painted subject against a landscape, ancient or modern, or depict it as a saint. It might set it alongside the Madonna and Child, or it might introduce visual clues in the clothing, furniture, and other objects. Thus, it reflected perforce of the still life and landscape forms. But it was strange for artists to paint pagan philosophers as enthusiastically as they did. For the narrative or emotional appeal of these figures at first seems somewhat remote. They were not the useful household items of still lives, and they hardly yielded the visual or moral panorama of landscapes or myths. On one level, however, ancient philosophers were good substitutes for the saints in Protestant circles, whose iconoclasm made saints unfit for religion or art. Whenever the Dutch Catholic humanist Erasmus invoked Saint Socrates, even if Protestants cringed at the word, they were troubled by a world without such moral examples. The ancient philosopher was a new, radical force to be reckoned with, and an old social stereotype, linked to university scholars, the ancient theologians they studied, and their abstruse ideas. He wore classical robes or scholars' gowns. He was often a shaggy and physically unkempt old man. He appeared self-absorbed, since formal philosophy divided itself easily into ancient Greek schools. he was usually a Greek philosopher. One of the most important paintings of ancient philosophy, not least because it gives us something approaching the entire cast, is Raphael's mural in the Vatican Library, known as the School of Athens, from 1509. Here, in this striking painting, a lot of attention has been given to the composition, to the organization of these philosophers in groups of 3 or 4 sometimes, or in some cases alone in contemplation or reading or writing. Visual texture is interesting in this, visual organization is interesting in this painting. The philosophers wear different colored costumes, perhaps for the purposes of the design. But I think that there may be some other subtle things going on. The characters in this scene are distributed around the central figures of Plato and Aristotle, who form a double portrait. Within the portrait, one gesturing to the heavens and the other to the earth. The characterization of the painting, though subtle, is sufficient for certain philosophers and their theories to be identified, largely by demeanor. Diogenes the Cynic, the philosopher famous for living in a tub, is identifiable by his sprawling and grouchy isolation and his drinking cup, which you can see beside him there. When Diogenes saw someone drinking water from a cupped hand, he expressed dismay at his own unnecessary cup. The grim-faced fellow in the foreground suggests Heraclitus, notorious, as I've said, for his weeping. His icons are the paper, pen, and inkwell, which you can see beside his elbow. The man writing in a book nearby is often identified as Pythagoras. However, his parallelism with Heraclitus, including both pen and inkwell, you see the inkwell above his book, better suggests Democritus, Heraclitus' usual counterpart. Perhaps more intriguing than the much debated identities of such philosophers is Raphael's ironic depiction of contemporary artists. Thus, Plato is modeled on Leonardo, complete with the famous Leonardo hand gesture. Sour-faced Heraclitus is Michelangelo. And among other figures depicted in the painting is Raphael himself on the far right with 2 globes. Overall, we detect a struggle between past and present ideas in which the ancient world reflects on present concerns. It is nevertheless remarkable that the artist chose to identify ancient philosophy with Renaissance art. Raphael's mural gives philosophy a dignified setting, if not a school, a portico, like the nave of the newly built St. Peter's. It presents a unified sense of philosophy, as if defined by a single artwork, however complex. That this wasn't the case is underscored by Diogenes, who was more street person than eminent schoolman, and who usually acted in satirical roles. So I will show 2 or 3 slides of Diogenes, because I think this materialist philosopher has a lot to say iconographically about Democritus and Heraclitus. In this 15th century manuscript illumination, swatches of royal blue reveal the lowly philosopher competing for authority with Alexander the Great, who once said that if he couldn't be himself, he would be Diogenes. Now, that's a good line, but it's scarcely believable. These two figures, Diogenes and Alexander the Great, were commonly associated with one another from ancient times. Above all, because they seem to manifest radically opposite views on material possession. Everything Diogenes has is contained within this tub. And Alexander was known for commanding 2/3 of the known world. This mid-17th century painting by Giovanni Langetti depicts a near-naked Diogenes in his tub, taking center stage from Alexander. You can barely see the tub, it's so dark, you can just see the top edge of it. And in fact, in that respect, that shadowy edge gives this tub something like the nuances of the soap bubble image we saw earlier in the talk. Just above Diogenes' head is a lantern, a lit lantern, I might add. You can barely detect it. This alludes to a famous story about Diogenes and his cynicism, his grim cynicism. Apparently, he walked out during broad daylight with a lit lantern, constantly in search of a true man, which he could never find. In this portrait, Giuseppe de Ribera, who made many studies of philosophers, depicts an ultra-modern Diogenes in a sham of seriousness, sternly carrying a lantern in broad daylight in search of that same true man. It's quite a dark painting for the daylight setting, but as I've suggested, daylight for Diogenes is as every bit as dark as night. What interests me about this painting, however, aside from the contrast of light and darkness, is the youthful nature of this old philosopher. He has shock black hair, very young hair. He has very animated young eyes, but his beard is flecked with white. He is what the Romans would call a puer senex, a young old man. Such imagery highlights a different strain of portraiture, preferring singular human drama to generalized concept. It reveals another side of old men. Their crude physical appearance, cantankerousness, and indifference to material life on the threshold of death. I'm getting older, but I don't feel cantankerous as yet. But during the question period, we can discuss this matter. The theme illustrates Socrates' definition of philosophy as a contemplation of death. What we see in this imagery, however, is not the wisdom of restraint growing out of experience, but wild and youthful prodigality. Diogenes was an exuberant man, notorious for debased sexuality, about which the less said, the better. But his appeal was vast in the Renaissance for mocking the even more debased standards of society, notably those of philosophers making claims on truth. We mustn't lose sight of the drama stirred by such old men, who illustrated good-natured dotage or senility and the wisdom of not claiming to know, which was known as wise folly. In what follows, I will focus on images of philosophy lying between the school of Athens and Diogenes, and somewhat between sorrow and joy, but depicting wise folly and aged melancholy through the drama of laughter and tears, and through Democritus and Heraclitus. Democritus, who lived from about 460 to 370 BC, was known as the laughing philosopher because of his concept of cheerfulness and a reputation for uncontrollable laughter. Heraclitus, who lived somewhat earlier, from about 535 to 475 BC, was known as the weeping philosopher because of his theory of flux and an edema that made his eyes weep uncontrollably. The men were blind, Heraclitus from his edema, Democritus by his own hand, better to understand the world. They were materialist philosophers, interested primarily in human affairs and the natural world. Democritus's theories of atomism and infinite worlds were later embraced by the Epicureans. They approached meaning encyclopedically, through minute detail, and he regarded nature as the ultimate source of learning through artistic imitation. Heraclitus was known, as I've said, for his theory of flux, which is aptly described by the dictum, "No one steps in the same river twice." He believed that while people were capable of bettering themselves, they were doomed by their folly to miserable lives. Democritus believed that we are all fools, himself no less, and as such worthier of laughter than tears. Human life might be said to be a comedy in his eyes and a tragedy in Heraclitus's. Laughing or weeping, these melancholic philosophers were understood as comic figures illustrating the full trajectory of wise folly. Together, they would heighten emotional complexity in art. Before turning to paintings in this tradition, I will highlight two Renaissance double portraits. In the first, I apologize for having this in black and white. I've included it because I like this painting. I find it subtle and subtly communicative. This is a painting by Giovanni Bellini, which depicts two unidentified men, no relation to Democritus and Heraclitus, of different aspect, facing one another and looking forward. This theatrical mode of addressing both the interlocutor and the viewer was a feature of double portraiture in the period. Some elements of the painting are standard Bellini, the hats and hair, the costumes. But what I really like about this painting is the thoughtful way in which the two figures look obliquely across the painting, looking into abstract ideas. You don't know what they're thinking about. It makes the painting, it adds real subtlety to this painting. Hans Horvath's, better known The Ambassadors from 1533, features a wealthy landowner and a bishop on either side of the table of iconographic objects, staring forward implacably in visual parallelism. If the Bellini portrait may serve to highlight different social states, here political and religious power are clearly a subject, and secular authority is more expansive and has greater swagger, as is shown by the ermine robe and red tunic, as well as the arrogant pose. Let me draw your attention to the oblique shape at the bottom foreground of the painting. If you visit this painting in the National Gallery in London and look at it from one side, you'll see exactly what you see now, that odd form. If you look at it from another vantage point, you will see a perfectly framed human skull. This trompe-l'œil effect creates an anamorphic quality, the quality of one identity, one spirit, you might say, of something to inhabit different material forms. And here, I think this suggests something important about the psychology of this painting. You can divine very little from the faces of the two portrait subjects, but if you could look at them from a different perspective, you might be able to see into their personalities. Finally, this skull at the bottom of the painting makes it clearly a vanitas painting, an anticipation of still life vanitas paintings that would come much later in the tradition. I think we will find that some of the structure of this portrait and the iconography will feature in some of our double portraits of Democritus and Heraclitus. These two philosophers first became portrait subjects in the 15th century. The Italian humanist Ficino had such a portrait in his study perhaps as early as the 1460s. This early fresco by Donato Bramante from about 1477 will anchor my discussion of much later works. This is a very odd painting, all in strange sepia colors. Despite rich three-dimensional imagery, the fresco is surreal, seeming flat, old-fashioned, almost medieval, and from an artistic point of view, almost botched, as if the painter got something wrong. Note the glow between the two men. This is, of course, the topic of their deliberations, of their contemplations, their meditations. It's the world, their materialist philosophers. But this world has a little penumbra under it that makes it look an awful lot like that soap bubble image, which seems to be haunting the top. But also the round heads of these two men, they also have penumbras, as if they were painted on or pasted on afterwards. There's something very strange about that. Other aspects of this painting will be of some interest. The composition, the fact that Heraclitus is on the left and Democritus on the right. You'll see other painters play with that idea, that position. The fact that Heraclitus wears an elaborate red costume with ermine fur lining, and Democritus something like a Roman toga on top of a 15th century tunic. The play of light and darkness in the two figures is important. See the shadows on Heraclitus' face. Heraclitus has young, very dark hair. Democritus is bald, but has a tuft of hair in front. The men's hand gestures are of interest. Heraclitus' hands are folded, perhaps as in prayer, and Democritus gestures forward to the viewer. But the two figures look obliquely across the painting, Democritus upward, perhaps suggesting his blindness. Finally, the iconography of the open books and the world suggest the realm of their philosophy. Most of the following slides are of Dutch origin. I will speculate later why there were so many examples of this theme, more than 80 in 17th century Holland alone. And I'm going directly to the 17th century. Hendrik de ter Brucken produced separate portraits of the philosophers in 1628, whose realism was influenced by Caravaggio. Note again the old world costumes, this time graced by luminous exposed shoulders of the two philosophers. Here, I assume Democritus ought to be postured on the left because I think he's pointing in the direction of Heraclitus. Despite the ancientness of the imagery, Democritus is wearing a jaunty contemporary cap. In these paintings, Heraclitus is bald. He doesn't have the dark hair. And Democritus has dark hair. Heraclitus has a rich red gown, but Democritus shines with the light. Both men lean on terrestrial globes, but Democritus' terrestrial globe has demographic features and animal features, people and animals on its surface. Here is another painting by the same artist. And what's striking about this one, what's most striking, is the globe upon which they lean, which is entirely made up of interlocking humanity. It's stuffed with humanity. And this suggests the real subject of their preoccupations. They are the first great humanists. But the painting is also quite realistic. You see the realism in particular in the articulation of the faces of the two men. I like the lunacy on the one on the left. I'll call him the one on the left for the minute, as opposed to the somber contemplation of the one on the right. I want to take the one on the left to be Democritus, but look, he has his hands folded, like the Heraclitus we've seen earlier. I want to take the one on the right as Heraclitus, because he has his hand up at his head. But look, he's pointing the globe. Although these are very old men, they look ancient enough to have been just recently disinterred. They are really dressed in something more like a contemporary clerical or perhaps a monastic costume, both in black. The truth is, I can't tell you which one of these two philosophers is which. And I think that may be an important part of the painting, though I'm inclined to viewing the one on the left as Democritus. Also interesting is the bone supporting the book in the center of the painting, which indicates that this is, yet again, a vanitas painting. The next, more impressionistic painting is a double portrait by Jacob Jordaens from about 1630. Here, the coloration is very interesting because the red in Democritus' costume washes into the yellow and red flesh, the decrepit flesh of Heraclitus. The two men are joined as if at the hip, and they visually echo the globe upon which they rest. But what really captures my attention is the duality of this painting, the fact that it represents the ancient world vividly in the decrepit figure of Heraclitus on the right, but Democritus, who now has grey hair, not black, but he's not bald, Democritus is dressed like a pretty well-off burgher from the city of Antwerp. So this painting gives us a sense of antiquity brought squarely into modernity. Finally, look again at the hand gestures. Jan van Bieler's portrait from 1640 likewise plays around with elements of the Bramante fresco we saw earlier. Here the positioning is striking. Heraclitus is on the left and Democritus on the right. The color is striking in the play of light and darkness. Democritus wears the red costume and Heraclitus' costume is muted in its effects. Heraclitus is bald, his baldness shining in echo of the globe beneath them. The globe is more like a Christmas bottle than globe. Also, Democritus' shoulder is shining. Heraclitus has his hands folded, obviously, in prayer, and Democritus is pointing across the painting. I don't know what that folded up object is in Democritus' left hand, so I'll just pass over it. But I do want to talk about the hair. Democritus' hair is very useful. And there's something important in this. In this painting, as in all the others, the hair imagery, I think, is critically important, but I'm not altogether sure why. In England, for example, in an odd twist on radicalism, the Cavaliers, with their flowing locks, were Bohemians, and long hairs next to the Puritan Roundheads, both groups laying claims on orthodoxy. Think also of the biblical story of Jacob and Esau, in which hairy men are earnest and plain dealers, and hairless men, though supported by God, actors with something to hide. Jacob's use of animal fur to secure his father's blessing is an instance of imitating nature to replace nature, to put on a disguise, to make oneself another person. The costumes we've seen are, in this painting and in the other ones, are skillful flourishes, painterly effects compensating for the lack of dynamism of the subject matter, perhaps. But they are also foils for critically important faces. In Dutch art, the idea conforms to the tronie, literally the face, a genre dedicated to lively facial representation. We turn now to a work Rubens presented to the Spanish court in 1603. Despite its earlier date than the sequence of Dutch paintings, I've saved this brilliant display of colour and nuance for near the end of the series. The first thing to remark about this painting, I think, is that it's a landscape painting. You see that through the imagery behind them, which is also taken up somewhat in the coloration of the massive globe that lies between the two men. Note the contrast of light and darkness, and the striking contrast in colour. By the way, this is the image that graces the cover of my recently published book. Brilliant imagery. I think there's something going on in this painting, and I'm not quite sure what. There's what you might call a kind of allegory. But for me, ultimately, the allegory won't matter. Democritus, who's on the left, wears the brilliant gown, of course, the brilliant colored gown, but he's also a figuration of Christ. This is a typical Christ image. And his beautiful focal point hand gesture points both across the painting and upward, perhaps at the realms of spiritual and material philosophy. But evokes something of the power of the Leonardo imagery, hand gestures. And by contrast with the delicate imagery, the delicate features of Democritus in this painting, look how masculine and muscular the characteristics of Heraclitus are. This is what I think suggests there's something going on. To me, he is some kind of muscular, powerful hypocrite. Say a Jesuit, if we're in Spain in 1603, or perhaps a biblical Pharisee, or some other church figure, some hypocrite. Not that I'm identifying church figures with hypocrites, please, don't get me wrong. Rubens would revisit this theme in the late 1630s in two companion pieces, painted very near the end of his life. As you may see, certain ideas remain constant, and the bodies of the now much older men yield splendid reflections, hemispheres, demanding integration into a whole. The most idiosyncratic work of the series is by Johannes Morinus from about 1630. This is almost a cartoon-like painting, and so it's very interesting from that point of view. Again, note the dramatic use of darkness and light. I can't call it the interplay of colors, really. It's that overwhelming darkness which takes up 2/3 of the painting, and the brightness of Democritus's shoulder. Note also the different types of men. Heraclitus is an Old Testament patriarch, and a bitter one at that. He has a little bald patch on the top of his head, but otherwise he's completely hairy. Harry, and he's wringing his hands in a kind of bitter state of mind. Democritus is quite young, and he's impish, and in fact this is the most derisory hand gesture we will have seen in any of the paintings in the series, I think. His hand points at Heraclitus and the globe, but it also implicates us. It stares out at us, the viewers, in some menacing way. Here I want to recall the Rubens image of Heraclitus looking, the muscular Heraclitus, looking out at the viewer in a dangerous way. Here it's not so much dangerous, there's a kind of youthful, prodigal menace in this figure. Note the jaunty contemporary cap, but otherwise these are ancient figures. As a measure of the impact of the philosophers on Maurice, I will show you, without remark, two similar works by him. Growing out of these treatments, we turn to non-Dutch portraits of Democritus, finishing with two famous Dutch works. Here I wish to stress the modernity of the paintings, but so as to make a transition from the sarcasm of Maurice, whose sniggering Democrituses implicate the viewer in some colossal act of folly. We will begin with Agostino Carracci's Democritus from 1598. In this very mannered painting, the curled imagery of the hair converges with the ermine fur. The hands, too, are curled, delicately pointing, gesturing out at the viewer and towards Democritus himself. Democritus is an old man, but if you look at those eyes, they're young and vivid, and partly shaped by the curvature of the eyebrows. Despite his old age, this is a young trickster, and he's telling us, viewers, that we are in store for some ironic fun. The study in contrast is Diego Velázquez's portrait of Democritus from 1628. Here we see some of the standard features, the glow, the elaborate drapery. The philosopher here is neither an ancient wise fool nor a wise guy. More like a modern, courtly, and very Spanish. He is humorous outside his eyes. He smiles rather than laughing. Not that all the Democrituses we have seen so far have been laughing. In fact, a few of them have been very despondent. He is a conceiver of intrigues rather than jests. In this connection, it may be worth recalling Ribera's ultra-modern treatment of Diogenes the Cynic as a mock serious rogue. Ribera was to do similar things with Democritus and Heraclitus, though I show two portraits of the laughing philosopher alone. One depicts him as an MBA grad. He has a job. The other as an itinerant BA, jobless but happy enough. The men smile in self-congratulatory ways, but there is no laughter, and the humor is mostly registered in furrowed brows. Would you recognize these men? If Democritus is identifiable, it is by his book, and in the left portrait, by his pen and inkwell, which you can barely see. He is a representative of the world through writing. The title page engraving from Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1623, No Image of a Modern Man, makes roughly the same point, further ornamented by a prospect of the garden to which Democritus resorted in his spare time. The garden walls are engraved with images of the natural world standing out in a kind of braille, the mental sphere of Democritus's private life, his personal projection of the outside world. What I really want to say about this image and about this garden and the world that lies beyond it, but I feel I lack the courage to say it. But I'll steel myself and say things. What I really want to say is that this garden is Democritus's inkwell, and that he's dipping the pen he holds in his right hand into this inkwell in order to write down nature in his book. And in that sense, I think we need to be prepared to equate that sense of containment with Diogenes' tub for Diogenes, or for that matter, his drinking cup. So now I've said it, and you can disregard it and just march on to other things. Perhaps, even so, this imagery contributes to a fuller sense of the affinity of landscape prospects with the portraiture of Democritus and Heraclitus. Finally, two works revealing a double identity in which it would be impossible to recognize ancient philosophy without some cue. Two Rembrandt self-portraits in the guise of Democritus. The first was painted in 1628, the second 40 years later, shortly before Rembrandt's death. Is there a theme here of painters painting Democritus shortly before dying? In these paintings, Democritus lends himself to portraiture, young and old, in keeping with the artist's age. Note the open-throated laughter in the younger Rembrandt, Democritus. By contrast with the more contemplative register of the other painting, which we find really detectable, subtly detectable in the cheekbones, the heightened cheekbones, the raised eyebrows, as well as in the delicate mixture of colours. These are modern Democrituses, or modern Rembrandts, without hint of ancient philosophy. There are no props, gestures. Indeed, Rembrandt understands that he doesn't need elaborate symbolic effects, that colour and texture are enough to confer the wit. Here, the eyelids are half closed, only half letting the viewer in. But the eyes engage in ways not found in the other works, and we are not distracted by the competing iconography of clothes, books, and hands. What we have is the private individual personality revealing itself to itself and the viewer. In one of his epistles, the Roman poet Horace imagined reviving Democritus to attend the Roman theatre, which at the time was given over to elaborate devices designed to attract audiences, ridiculous simulations of the natural world, exotic giraffes and white elephants, the stuff of modern pantomime. Horace says that instead of watching the performance, Democritus would look away, his eyes fixed on the audience, and laugh at them. But this act of mockery would be theatre too, and would bring upon itself the laughter of 1,000 Democrituses. In gesturing, as he does in the works we have seen, Democritus points through the imagery to the viewer. He is thus the more open figure. Heraclitus's closed hands suggest a closed mind. In artistic terms, a formalist whose sense of purity has no need of audience participation or validation. He would not be standing here before you, for example. Rembrandt's self-portraits return the favor, removing Heraclitus from the picture, so to speak. For the laughing and weeping philosophers reflect opposing attitudes to formal hierarchies in which the disruptive comic muse invariably triumphs over the self-righteous tragic one. Above all, Democritus and Heraclitus are images of earthly vanity, of the vain desire of philosophy to overcome mortality or to offer consolation for it, and of the presumption of art to seize upon nature and make it stand still. I have left many unanswered questions in this talk. We may begin to see why ancient philosophers were important, but not what individual portraits mean, despite the fact that they clearly mean something. Their play of colour, form, and texture is obviously important. In time, elaborations like the royal blue of Diogenes' gown in the illuminated manuscript, or the ermine of silk in the Holbein painting, evolved from symbols of social estate into aspects of personality and private rather than public symbolism, which is difficult for us to grasp. This may have reflected witty senses of Democritus and Heraclitus as expressions of different forms of melancholy linked to yellow and black bile, bitter black bile. A crude way of expressing the wit of this was to paint Democritus in yellow and Heraclitus in black. A subtler way was to encrypt meaning in mixed colours, or in an even subtler palette adverting to personal complexity, like the faces of portrait subjects themselves. If I say that Democritus was seen as a quasi-Christian and a literary muse, and Heraclitus as a Puritan or authoritarian, disdainfully committed to a static, hierarchical understanding of the world, these statements give us no special insight into the psychological motives of Rubens in mixing reds and blacks and casting Heraclitus as some abstract enemy to Democritus' Christ, and even less insight into the subtle hues added by Rembrandt to portraits of himself. Even so, 17th century Dutch art revealed unusual concern with domestic material life. Genre painting shone a light on the ordinary lives of people, regular people, as distinct from the sumptuous lives of those of high estate and the epic art that portrayed them. More than any European art, it seems, Dutch painting spoke for a leveled humanity in which great figures are no greater than the low. This was art for the people, the better part of 200 years before the American and French revolutions. It was also detailed art of the real world, vivid psychological realism by contrast with the romanticized or allegorized narratives of European art, not so much detailed exactitude, but paradoxically in its use of stereotype, hyper-theatricality, and received color and nuance, sensitivity to the ways in which real lives reach out from the photograph, caught in a flash of time, and speak to the ceaselessly unfolding history of the world. Thank you.